They told us the crust of Kharnos-Delta would strip the skin off a body in under an hour. They told us the air carried enough sulfur to dissolve a set of lungs from the inside out. What the Aurelian Concord never understood, not once in 3,000 years of cataloging the galaxy's fragile little species, was that humans do not fear a bad neighborhood. Give us a week of misery and something sharp to hold, and we will build a porch on it. Warden Asen Threll did not despise humans. Despite was an emotion that required his species, the Asra, to invest energy in something they had already dismissed as beneath calculation, and the Asra did not waste energy. What he felt, if pressed, was something closer to a persistent, itching bafflement. He sat in the upper observation ring above Sector 9, a lukewarm cup of mineral tonic cooling in his long gray fingers, and watched the storm-wrought ferns twist in the wind below. Kharnos-Delta was not built to kill quickly. A quick death taught a subject nothing. It was built to kill slowly, methodically, in 100 small increments, each one designed to erode a newcomer species until the only rational choice left was the extraction beacon clipped to their collar. Gravity sat at 1.35 standard, heavy enough to turn a sprint into a crawl within minutes. The lower atmosphere was thick with drifting spore clouds that could seize a nervous system if inhaled unfiltered. The rivers ran the color of rust and burned exposed flesh on contact. It was, by every metric the Concord used, one of the worst places in the charted galaxy to spend a long weekend. The facility itself had been carved directly into the ridge system over the course of decades, an entire wing of observation rings, containment vaults, and recovery bays built around the singular purpose of finding out, with cold and repeatable precision, exactly how much a newly contacted species could endure before its will simply gave out. Every candidate species that wished to join the wider Concord as a recognized member, with all the trade access and mutual defense guarantees that entailed, passed through a facility like this one first. It was not cruelty, Threll had always told himself. It was due diligence. A species that could not survive Kharnos-Delta could not be trusted to hold a defensive line when it mattered, and the Concord had buried too many allied fleets in the past trusting partners who folded the moment the pressure became real. Most species did not last the first rotation. The Vashtu, tall and reed-thin, had folded in under 6 hours, screaming for pickup the moment the first acid squall hit their unshielded membranes. The Koran Warcast, armored and proud, had held out 4 days before the isolation cracked something behind their eyes and they triggered every beacon in their unit simultaneously. Now it was humanity's turn to sit under the microscope, and Threll had already drafted half his report before the drop pod had finished burning through the mesosphere. Vitals are stabilizing faster than projected, the sensor technician beside him said, her mandibles ticking in mild concern. Heart rate spiked on entry, but it's already leveling. Threll leaned toward the display. Leveling how quickly? Too quickly. It's like watching someone turn down a dial rather than watching a body recover. On the main feed, the pod's outer hatch blew free with a hiss of hydraulic pressure, and a wash of orange spore mist rolled out across the ridge. 3 shapes staggered down the ramp into ankle-deep rust mud. Threll pulled their files up on a side panel without looking away from the feed. Sergeant Rhea Okafor, infantry, mid-30s, a service record longer than the display could scroll without truncating. Corporal Daniel Vance, combat engineer, late 20s, a disciplinary file that suggested he had personally tested the patience of at least 4 commanding officers. And Dr. Marisol Ibarra, combat medic, early 30s, the kind of intelligence scoring that made the Concord's assessment algorithms flag her file twice for verification. They looked, to Threll's eye, exactly as fragile as their species dossier suggested. No natural plating. No secondary lungs. No redundancy in a single organ system that he could identify. A narrow band of survivable temperatures barely wider than a rounding error. It was, frankly, embarrassing that this species had made it off their homeworld at all. The heavier gravity hit them first. Okafor's knees buckled and she caught herself on one gloved hand, breath fogging out in a sharp white burst through her mask filter. Vance staggered sideways, cursing in a language the translation matrix flagged as containing excessive profanity density, recommend partial filtering. Ibarra planted her boots wide, braced against the pull, and did not go down, though the effort visibly cost her. Good, Thrall thought. The baseline is established. Now the braking begins. Mark the time, he told the technician. I estimate an extraction request within 28 hours. The gravity alone will burn through their glycogen reserves by nightfall. On the feed, Vance straightened, wiped a smear of rust mud off his visor, and looked up at the churning ochre sky. He said something that made Okafor turn her head sharply toward him. Come on, Vance said, voice crackling faintly through the audio pickup. It's not even raining acid yet. This is basically a beach day. The sky answered him with a low, grinding peal of thunder, and within seconds a curtain of thin, biting rain began to hiss against their armor, each droplet leaving a faint chemical scorch mark where it struck exposed plating. You had to open your mouth, Ibarra said flatly, not even looking at him. Every time, Okafor muttered, already hauling herself upright against the pull of the gravity well. Seal your filters. Grab what you can carry. We need elevation before this mud turns into a river. They did not scatter. They did not freeze. They moved with the grim, practiced coordination of people who had clearly done far worse in far worse places. Vance shouldered a supply crate that had to weigh close to 100 kilos in this gravity, grunting audibly through the strain, and did not set it back down. Thrall watched them claw their way up a jagged basalt slope, slipping, swearing, hauling each other upright by whatever strap or handle presented itself. Respiration approaching flagged thresholds, the technician reported. Muscular fatigue markers climbing fast. Let them climb, Thrall said. The crest of that ridge is exposed to the katabatic winds. Once the sun drops, surface temperature falls to -18 standard within the hour. They will feel the futility of the exercise soon enough, and they will call for pickup. 8 hours later, the light died entirely, and Sector 9 dissolved into a blackness broken only by violent green flickers of high-altitude static discharge. The temperature dropped exactly as projected. Thrall left the observation ring for a short rest cycle, fully expecting to return to 3 blinking extraction signals on the tactical display. Instead, he returned to a smear of orange heat on the thermal overlay. Explain that, he said, jabbing a claw at the screen. Is there a fault in their thermal regulators? Has something ignited their supply crate? The technician squinted at the readout, mandibles working. No, Warden. They built a fire. That is not possible. The local atmosphere carries a nitrogen saturation that should smother open combustion within minutes. They stripped the ignition cells from the drop pod's emergency flares and used them to catch the resin bark off the local scourwood stands. It burns slow. It burns hot enough that the moisture in the air isn't extinguishing it. Thrall zoomed the optical feed until the ridge filled the display. Beneath a shallow overhang the 3 of them had blasted out of the rock with a demolition charge. A small, stubborn fire crackled and spat sparks into the dark. They had shed their outer plating and stacked it near the flames to dry. Ibarra crouched over the fire with a battered metal flask balanced on a bent piece of wire, and Okafor sat with a whetstone, running it along the edge of a combat blade in a slow, rhythmic scrape that carried clearly over the audio pickup. Vance lounged against the rock wall, boots stretched dangerously close to the flames, humming something tuneless and off-key. This tastes like burnt cable insulation, Ibarra announced, pulling the flask back from the fire and grimacing after a cautious sip. Pass it here, Vance said, holding out a hand. Beggars don't get to be picky, document. He drank, coughed hard enough to double over, thumped his own chest twice, and exhaled with theatrical satisfaction. Smooth. Really clears the sinuses. Drink and be quiet, Okafor said without looking up from her blade. Tomorrow we scout the perimeter and figure out what's actually trying to kill us out here. Watch rotation is 2 hours on, 4 off. Vance, you've got first shift. If you're asleep when I check, I will personally feed you to whatever's making that noise down in the ravine. Copy that, boss. Vance tore off a chunk of ration bar with his teeth, chewing slowly as he stared out into the absolute black beyond the firelight. He was smiling. Threll stared at the screen for a long moment, genuinely unmoored. They were freezing. They were exhausted. They were breathing filtered air that still stung on every inhale, and drinking something that had visibly disgusted the person drinking it. Why weren't they broken? On the third rotation, before Threll had even considered the second phase, the three of them did something that made the technician quietly minimize the audio feed and ask if she should flag it for a wellness review. They went for a walk. Not a patrol. Not a defensive sweep. Okafor called it a perimeter familiarization exercise over the comms, but the tone in her voice was unmistakably the tone of someone who was simply bored of sitting under a rock overhang and wanted to see what else was trying to kill her. They followed the ravine east, past a stand of scourwood trees whose bark wept a faint luminescent sap, and down into a shallow basin where the rust-colored mud gave way to a field of low, bulbous fungal growths the size of a human torso. "Don't touch those," Ibarra said immediately, crouching a safe distance away and studying one through a handheld scanner. "They're pressure-sensitive. Spore payload triggers on contact vibration, and half the local wildlife seems to have evolved lungs that specifically hate us." "Noted," Vance said, and then, 3 seconds later, nudged one with the toe of his boot anyway. The fungal growth detonated in a soft, wet cough of orange spores, and Vance stumbled backward, coughing hard behind his filtered mask while Okafor and Ibarra both stared at him with matching expressions of profound disappointment. "Why?" Ibarra said. "For science," Vance wheezed. In the observation ring, Threll pulled up the spore analysis in real time, expecting to watch a rapid neurological event unfold on the biometric overlay. Instead, the readout showed a mild elevation in respiratory irritation and nothing else. Human filtration masks, it turned out, were rated for particulate densities well beyond what the Kharnos-Delta ecosystem could throw at them, a detail the original Concord risk assessment had apparently underweight by a significant margin. "They just weaponized their own curiosity into a field test," the technician muttered, half to herself, updating the hazard database with a note that would take 3 separate approval committees to process. Further along the ridge, they found a shallow cave system carved into the basalt, and Okafor called a halt long enough to sweep it with a hand light. The walls were lined with a fine mineral crust that glittered faintly even in the dim glow, and a slow trickle of clean, unfiltered groundwater ran along one wall into a shallow pool. "That's not on the survey," Ibarra said, testing the water with a strip from her medkit and watching it change color slowly. "It's clean. Actually clean. No heavy metals, no acid content worth flagging." "Fresh water source," Okafor said, already thinking 3 steps ahead in a way that made Threll's grip on his tonic cup tighten involuntarily. "That changes the math on how long we can sit tight out here." "You're not supposed to be settling in," Threll said aloud, to no one, because the feed obviously carried no audio back to the ridge. "You are supposed to be requesting extraction." Nobody on the ridge heard him. They marked the cave on a hand-drawn map scratched into a flattened ration tin, and walked back to camp already discussing whether the mineral crust on the walls could be ground down into something useful for patching armor seals. By the 4th rotation, whatever novelty Threll had assumed would wear off had not worn off. If anything, it had calcified into something worse, routine. The Concord training manual was explicit on this point. If environmental stress alone failed to fracture a subject's resolve within a standard cycle, biological pressure was to be introduced. Kharnos-Delta's ecosystem was not passive. It was, by design, aggressively hostile. They had, by that point, given the fire a name. Vance called it the office, and had taken to announcing his shift changes as though he were clocking in and out of a job, a habit that Okafor tolerated with the weary patience of someone who had clearly worked with him for years and had long since stopped expecting it to stop. Ibarra had rigged a small still from spare tubing and a section of scavenged canister, and the black root sap brew had gone from something they choked down out of necessity to something they argued about the strength of, the way people argue about coffee when coffee is the only good thing left in a given day. "This batch is too bitter," Vance announced, holding his cup up to the firelight and squinting at it with the seriousness of a man reviewing a vintage. "You said the last batch was too weak," Ibarra said, not looking up from the undersuit seam she was stitching. "Both things can be true. I contain multitudes. You contain a concerning amount of stimulant for someone who's supposed to be resting between watch shifts. Doc, in this economy, sleep is a luxury good." Okafor, sharpening the same knife she had already sharpened twice that rotation, didn't look up either. "If either of you dies of a caffeine overdose on a planet that's already trying to kill you with everything else, I am putting that in the after-action report exactly as embarrassingly as it deserves." "Put it in bold," Vance said. "I want them to really feel it back at command." Threll, watching from the observation ring, found himself running the exchange back twice, trying to locate the moment where their morale should have cracked under the accumulated strain and instead finding only what could best be described, in Asra terms, as contentment. It was, he noted privately, an extremely inconvenient thing to be watching unfold on a monitor that was supposed to be documenting a controlled psychological collapse. "Initiate the second phase," Threll ordered. The technician hesitated, mandibles pressed flat against her jaw in a gesture Threll recognized as discomfort. "Warden, standard protocol calls for a graduated introduction of predatory stimuli. These subjects are already operating under significant physical strain. She paused, checking a secondary feed, they're fermenting a stimulant from the local root sap." Threll looked at the display, where Ibarra was carefully reducing a thick black liquid over the fire, testing it periodically with a look of grim, professional focus, while Okafor and Vance waited nearby with the patience of people anticipating their morning ration of something they actually enjoyed. "They are not straining," Threll said. "They are settling in. Initiate the second phase. Full deployment." Deep beneath the ravine, heavy containment locks disengaged with a low mechanical groan. The Concord's field teams called them Duskfangs, six-limbed apex predators engineered for exactly this terrain, their hides woven with an adaptive light-bending membrane that rendered them nearly invisible against the rust-colored rock, jaws strong enough to shear through reinforced plating in a single bite. 4 of them were released into the ravine below Sector 9, their tracking collars locking instantly onto the thermal bloom of the human camp. "Time to contact," Threll asked. 6 minutes, the technician replied. "Should I stage the recovery drones?" "The Duskfangs are calibrated to incapacitate, not kill. Human physiology is," Threll paused, running the numbers again. "Stage them. Do not launch until requested." On the ridge, the 3 of them were mid-argument over the structural soundness of a barricade they'd lashed together from felled scourwood trunks and hardened mud when Okafor went suddenly, completely still. She didn't shout. She didn't move. "Contact," she said quietly. "Downslope, my 10. Ibarra dropped what she was holding and slid behind a rock outcrop, sidearm already drawn. Vance didn't reach for his rifle at all. Instead he grabbed a length of scavenged support strut he'd pried loose from the drop pod's frame, hefting it like a club. "Thermals showing nothing," Ibarra hissed, tapping the side of her visor. "Neither's mine," Okafor murmured, slowly bringing her rifle up. "But the wind just died, and there's a smell like burnt copper on it. Something's cloaked." Threll leaned forward hard enough to nearly spill his tonic. "How is she detecting that?" "The Duskfang's electromagnetic signature is negligible. Our own sensor suite requires a dedicated active scan to register it." The first Duskfang broke cover in a blur of muscle and shifting camouflage, aimed squarely at Okafor, a silent strike meant to pin her and shatter a collarbone on impact. It never landed. Okafor dropped backward through the mud at the last possible instant and put a plasma round directly into the creature's exposed chest at point-blank range. The bolt didn't punch through the subdermal plating, but the kinetic force sent the beast tumbling sideways with a roar like tearing sheet metal. Vance was already moving. He didn't retreat from the sound. He ran toward it, swinging the metal strut in a full overhead arc that connected with an audible crack against the creature's jaw as it tried to recover. It lashed out with a claw, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling into the mud, but the impact strut had already done its work. The beast staggered, disoriented. "Vance!" Ibarra shouted. Two more Duskfangs broke from cover, flanking wide. Standard Concord doctrine called for a tight defensive huddle and an immediate extraction request in the face of overwhelming predatory force. The three of them did the precise opposite. They pressed the attack. Ibarra hurled a concussion charge, not at the creatures themselves but at the rock face directly above them. The blast showered the ravine in dust and jagged stone, and the Duskfangs, reliant on sight and vibration to hold their camouflage stable, shrieked as their light-bending hides flickered and failed under the sudden particulate coating. Okafor used the confusion to close distance. She wasn't shooting anymore, the range was too tight for the rifle to be worth anything. She drew her blade instead, vaulted a fallen log, landed square on the back of a disoriented Duskfang, and drove the knife into the exposed sensory cluster behind its skull. The beast convulsed once and went still. The two remaining predators, watching their pack-mate die in real time, hesitated. Their conditioning had never accounted for the possibility of being the hunted. Vance dragged himself up out of the mud, chest plate deeply scored but intact, spat blood, and picked up his strut again. "That's it? That's what you've got?" he shouted at the tree-lean. One of the two survivors lunged anyway, a last desperate strike aimed low at Ibarra's exposed flank as she reloaded. Okafor was already moving, throwing herself bodily into the creature's shoulder and driving it off balance just enough that its jaws snapped shut on empty air instead of armor. The impact sent her rolling through the mud, and for a half-second Threll was certain he was about to watch a human die on his monitor for the first time. She came up with her rifle already tracking, put 2 rounds into the creature's exposed throat before it could recover its footing, and it collapsed thrashing into the mud beside its dead pack-mate. The remaining Duskfangs melted back into the ravine's shifting shadows and did not return. In the observation ring, the technician had gone pale beneath her chitin. "Warden. They killed a Class 4 bioweapon. With scrap metal and a hunting knife." Threll said nothing. He watched Okafor climb off the dead creature, wiping mud and glowing green blood from her visor. Ibarra was already at Vance's side, running practiced hands over his chest plate to check the seal. Okafor walked over to the second dead Duskfang and nudged it with her boot. "Look at the muscle density on this thing," she said, more to herself than anyone. She pulled her blade free, wiped it on her thigh, and glanced back at the others. "Hey! Anybody willing to bet this is edible?" Ibarra stared at her. "It's a bioengineered apex predator on a planet that wants to melt our organs. It will absolutely poison you. We're already drinking boiled tree sap as coffee," Vance pointed out, limping over to join them. "I say we carve off a flank and find out. If it turns black when it cooks, we're not eating it. If it smells good, we are." Threll watched, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, methodical madness unfolding in front of him. They were not requesting extraction. They were butchering the Concord's most feared field predator with the same casual efficiency they'd used to kill it. 2 hours later the fire had grown into a proper blaze, and pale strips of meat sizzled on metal skewers over the coals. The smell, of roasting fat and something faintly metallic underneath, drifted upward toward the atmospheric sensors ringing the sector. Okafor took the first bite, chewed slowly and deliberately while Vance and Ibarra watched with obvious anticipation, then swallowed. "Little gamey," she announced, dead serious. "Needs salt." "Tastes like venison," Vance said, already grabbing a skewer of his own. "I'll take it." Ibarra sighed and reached for a piece anyway. Within the hour the three of them were seated around the fire, eating the literal nightmare that had been engineered to break them, trading stories about worse deployments they'd survived. Threll listened to the audio feed long after his shift had technically ended. "Warden," the technician said eventually. "What are your orders?" Threll looked at the biometric overlay. Cortisol was not merely dropping. Dopamine markers were climbing steadily. They were not enduring this. They were enjoying it. "Cut the feed," he said quietly. "And connect me to High Adjudicator Vesic. We have a situation." High Adjudicator Vesic did not display emotion easily, and rarely bothered to try. As senior arbiter of the Concord Species Integration Program, his entire function was to measure, categorize, and file. He studied the holographic projection floating above Threll's console, for compound eyes blinking in a slow, staggered pattern that Threll had never seen him use for anything but genuine confusion. "You are telling me," Vesic said, his translated voice a flat synthetic drone, "that the bipeds are consuming a Class 4 bioweapon as a food source?" "Yes, Adjudicator. Seasoned with mineral salt from their ration kits. And the environmental stressors. The gravity. The atmospheric toxicity. They complain about them," Threll admitted, pulling up an audio transcript. "But the complaints are not distress signals. They're recreational. The medic has isolated a mild stimulant compound from the local flora. They brew it, and they've begun trading portions of it for favorable shifts on watch rotation." Vesic's mandibles went still. On the projection, the three humans sat beneath their rock overhang under a sky churning with violent purple static. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero standard. Vance was juggling 3 smooth river stones with visible boredom. Okafor was carving a small tally mark into her rifle stock. Ibarra was mending a tear in Vance's undersuit using a needle she'd carved from a duskfang bone. They looked worn. Vance had a spreading bruise along his jaw. Okafor moved with the stiffness of joints grinding under too much strain for too long. Ibarra's eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. But the biometric overlay told a completely different story. Steady heart rates. Cohesive, synchronized neural activity. They were functioning as a single unit, not 3 individuals barely holding on. "This is unacceptable," Vesic said finally. "This facility exists to establish the failure threshold of a candidate species. If they do not break, our entire assessment framework is compromised. If the Concord admits a species that does not fear Kharnos-Delta, we destabilize the deployment hierarchy for every allied force that follows. What would you have me do, Adjudicator?" "Initiate Directive 0. A cold weight settled somewhere in Threll's lower thorax. "Adjudicator, Directive 0 is a containment breach protocol. It generates an artificial Category 5 convection storm and releases the subsurface swarm nests. It is, functionally, a death sentence." "They are already dead, Warden. They simply refuse to recognize it. Flood the sector. Break them." "Adjudicator, respectfully, the metrics may simply be wrong. Perhaps this species does not fail the way the framework assumes every species must eventually fail. Every framework has a floor, Warden. We have simply not found this species' floor yet. That is precisely why Directive 0 exists. And if the floor does not exist, then we will have learned that too," Vesic said, with the flat, unbothered finality of someone closing a file. "Execute the directive." The connection severed. Threll stared at the space where the projection had been, then back at the monitors. Vance had dropped one of his stones. Okafor was laughing, low and rough. Threll reached for the command console. His fingers hovered over the authorization sequence longer than protocol allowed. He did not want them dead. He wanted, more than he could easily admit, to understand them. He entered the sequence anyway. Down in Sector 9, the wind simply stopped. The constant hiss of acid drizzle cut out mid-fall. The distant rumble of the ravine's mud falls fell silent. Okafor's laughter cut off just as fast. She looked up. The static clouds above had begun twisting into a single unnatural spiral, centered directly over their camp. Visors down, she snapped, and the easy campfire warmth vanished from her voice instantly, replaced by something flat and hard. Seal up. Now. What's happening? Ibarra asked, locking her helmet into place with a sharp click. Pressure's dropping, Vance said, eyes on his gauntlet display. Fast. Way too fast for this to be natural. We've got a manufactured low-pressure cell forming right on top of us. They're turning the dial up, Okafor said grimly, grabbing her rifle. Strike the camp. Secure the shelter frame. Move. They had, over the last 2 rotations, stretched a duskfang hide over a scavenged wood frame, building a shelter far sturdier than it had any right to be. They scrambled to anchor the corners, driving carved bone stakes deep into the rocky soil. Then the ground began to hum. It wasn't the heavy tread of a duskfang. It was a high, buzzing vibration, like 1,000 tiny motors firing in unison. The rust-colored mud at the base of the ridge began to churn and split open. A tide of segmented black bodies boiled up out of the earth, swarm ticks, scavenger insects the size of large dogs, mandibles capable of shearing through hull plating, driven to the surface in a frenzy by the collapsing air pressure. Contact! Vance shouted, rifle already up. Thousands of them, coming up the slope. Conserve ammo, Okafor ordered. They're swarming, not hunting individually. We need a bottleneck. Ibarra, prep the incendiaries. Vance, get the reserve power cell from the pod. The wind returned all at once, hitting them like a wall. The manufactured storm touched down in full, uprooting scourwood trees and hurling them across the ravine. Acid hail began hammering the shelter, shattering harmlessly against the treated hide. The first wave of ticks crested the ridge. Okafor fired, the bolt ripping through the front line and flash boiling the fluid inside 3 of the creatures at once. They burst in a spray of pale green ichor. The swarm didn't slow. They simply climbed over the smoking husks of their own dead, mandibles clicking in a horrible, mechanical rhythm. A second wave broke off from the main body and tried to flank the shelter through a narrow gap in the rebuilt barricade. Vance saw it a half-second before it would have mattered, dragging a section of scourwood trunk across the gap and bracing it with his own body weight while the mass of ticks piled uselessly against the wood, mandibles shrieking against a surface they couldn't get purchase on. A little help wouldn't kill you. He shouted, and Ibarra was already there, driving her boot knife through the gap into anything that got too close, methodical and unhurried even as the swarm screeching climbed in pitch around them. Ibarra threw an incendiary. The white-hot flare of phosphorus engulfed a dozen ticks at once, their armor melting under the heat, and they collapsed shrieking in a sound like grinding metal. Vance! Now! Vance hauled the auxiliary power cell to the edge of the barricade, heavy and humming with unstable charge. Fire in the hole, he screamed, and kicked it hard down the steep, rocky slope, straight into the densest part of the swarm. Take the shot, he yelled, diving behind cover. Okafor didn't hesitate. She tracked the rolling cell, calculated the angle in a fraction of a second, and fired. The bolt struck the containment housing directly. The resulting explosion defied easy description. A dome of blinding white-blue light rolled across the slope, vaporizing mud, stone, and hundreds of swarm ticks in an instant. The shockwave hit the ridge a half-second later, slamming Okafor into the rock wall and collapsing half the barricade. When the ringing in their ears finally faded, the slope below was gone, replaced by a glassed, glowing crater. What remained of the swarm scattered in every direction, its collective drive shattered by the sheer violence of the blast. Under the dusk-fang hide shelter, Ibarra shoved debris off her chest and looked over at Vance, who was filthy, bleeding from a cut above one eyebrow, and grinning like he'd just won something. Okafor was already back on her feet, rifle up, scanning the smoke. Clear, she coughed. Swarms routed. In the observation ring, Thrall stared at the tactical display in something that, in a human, might have been called disbelief. The swarm was broken. The storm still raged, but the shelter held, entirely unbothered by the acid hail streaming off its treated hide. They had not merely survived Directive Zero. They had turned the facility's own emergency power cell into the weapon that beat it. The technician slowly set down her headset. Warden. Their extraction window opens in 4 hours. Orders? Thrall looked at the glowing signatures on the display for a long moment, feeling something distinctly Anasra settle into his chest. Something close to awe, and something close to dread, arriving together. We go get them, he said. Before they work out how to shoot down the storm itself. The Concord recovery shuttle descended over the ridge 4 hours later, its repulsor scattering the toxic mist in wide concentric rings. The ramp lowered heavily against the scorched basalt. Thrall stood at the top in a full pressurized hazard suit, flanked by a squad of heavily armed Corran peacekeepers. He had expected, on some level he wasn't proud of, to find 3 traumatized survivors huddled in the dark, desperate for the sterile comfort of a medical bay. Instead, he stepped out onto a settlement. The barricade had been rebuilt and reinforced with fused glass from the crater's edge. The hide shelter stood taut and dry, shedding the last of the acid drizzle without effort. A crude chimney, built from hollowed scourwood logs and packed mud, vented a thin ribbon of smoke into the churning sky. Okafor stood by the fire, a skewer of roasted tick meat in one hand, and looked up at the descending shuttle without much apparent surprise. About time, she called over the engine noise. We're almost out of coffee. Thrall walked down the ramp slowly. The Corran guards kept their weapons raised, eyeing the scattered remains of butchered predators around the camp with obvious unease. One of them, a heavily armored veteran of the Corran war caste who had personally lasted less than 4 days on this same ridge during his own species trial, stared at the camp for a long moment before quietly lowering his weapon entirely, as though some old, private grudge with this planet had just been settled on his behalf by someone else. A second wave of technicians moved past Thrall to begin the formal decommissioning survey, cataloging the barricade, the shelter, the crude smokehouse rack strung with drying strips of duskfang meat, the neat stack of scavenger tick carapaces set aside near the fire, already half converted into something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginnings of a set of hand tools. One of the technicians paused over the carapace pile, turned to Thrall with an expression he didn't have a translation matrix category for, and simply shook her head slowly before moving on. Vance emerged from behind the barricade wearing a duskfang skull as a rough shoulder plate, looking entirely, unervingly at home in the ruin around him. Your Warden Thrall, Okafor said, taking another bite of meat. She gestured loosely at the ship. This it, then? Test's over, or is there another round coming? The trial is concluded, Thrall said, his translator struggling slightly to keep pace with his own disbelief. You defeated a Class 4 predator with improvised weapons. You detonated the equivalent of a localized ordnance strike to repel a subsurface swarm. You have been consuming the facility's bioweapons for sustenance. Ibarra stepped out of the shelter, slinging a duffel of salvaged gear over one shoulder. Survived is a strong word for it. Honestly, if the gravity wasn't wrecking my spine, I might have asked to stay another week. Protein's protein, Vance said with a shrug, holding out a strip of dried meat. You guys want some for the ride back? Tastes like shoe leather, but it keeps you moving. Thrall looked at the offered jerky. He looked at the fortress of mud, bone, and glass they had built from a planet designed to kill them. He looked at 3 fragile, unarmored, narrow-temperature range organisms standing upright and unbroken in a gravity well that should have crushed them weeks ago. No, he said quietly. Keep your rations. He turned back toward the shuttle, already composing the report in his mind. He knew exactly what he was going to write. Vesic would not like it. The wider Concord would not believe it. But it would be the truth. Humans did not survive hostile worlds. They settled them, complained about the weather, filed the local wildlife under dinner, and started charging rent to anything unfortunate enough to try and dislodge them. He thought, not for the first time, about the readiness scores the Concord had assigned humanity before this trial had even begun, low, cautious, hedged with a dozen qualifiers about unverified resilience potential. He thought about how carefully the entire species integration hierarchy had been built around the assumption that every candidate species eventually found its floor, the point past which fear simply took over and shut the whole system down. He had watched 3 unarmored bipeds refuse to locate that floor across 11 consecutive rotations, and he was no longer certain the floor existed at all, or that anyone in the Concord actually wanted to find out what happened if it didn't. As the shuttle lifted off, leaving the scorched, still burning ridge of Kharnos-Delta behind, Threll found himself thinking of something far colder than the storm outside. If this was what 3 unarmed humans did when trapped and abandoned on a planet built to kill them, what exactly would an entire fleet of them do once they were finally let off the leash? And that, in the end, is the real reason the Aurelian Concord quietly stopped classifying humanity as a species to be evaluated, and started classifying them as a phenomenon to be monitored from a very safe distance. You do not throw humans into hell to teach them a lesson. You just end up giving them a place to build their next campfire. If this one hit different, drop a like, subscribe for more, and hit the bell so the next story doesn't slip past you. Tell me in the comments. If you got dropped on Kharnos-Delta with a rifle and a lighter, what's the first thing on that planet you'd throw on the grill?